Welcome to Abralina ao Vivo, the online congress organized by the Brazilian Association of Linguistics and a whole host of other linguistic associations from all around the world. I am very pleased to introduce to you today Felix Ameka, a professor at University of Leiden in the Netherlands. And his talk is Linguistic Marginalia. Professor Ameka is a linguist working on African languages, mostly Kwa languages, and among which most notably Ewe. And I will just let him talk to you directly. Thank you a lot, Felix, to be here. I think this is going to be very important, and I'm handing over. Please enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, Miguel, and the whole team for inviting me to be part of this. This is a wonderful and fantastic opportunity, and at this time we are sort of together online. I will now try to share my screen. That's funny. I have a problem here.
Hi, Felix. Can you see the share screen button?
I have this, no, I can't at the moment. And I don't know why I can't get onto the Zoom. I see your Abralin, I see you come on, but.
Okay. But you
what
have,
I'll do, wait a minute.
You should go, can you click on the Zoom icon?
Yes, that's what I've been doing, but it doesn't. I don't know why it doesn't come up. Wait, let me. Okay. Oh dear. Maybe I will go out and come back in, okay?
Sure, no problem. Okay.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can still. Maybe you should close your PowerPoint file.
Yes, I've closed it, so I'm now going to open it.
Okay. Are you on Zoom?
Yes, I'm on Zoom.
Can you see the
now
share
I'm going
screen?
to share. I'm going to share.
Great.
What am I sharing? I'm sharing Zoom.
I can see your.
Yeah. Can you see my?
Yes.
PowerPoint?
Not yet, just your browser.
Just my browser, okay. I'll stop sharing and then I'll go back and share now.
Is your PowerPoint open?
Yes. So I'm going to start share, and yes, it's now there.
Great. Okay, so I can see your PowerPoint.
Oh, good. Okay. Then I'm now going to slideshow.
Great, it's working now. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity. And I want to talk about linguistic marginalia and grammars of use. I'm going to start by talking about the fact that as humans, we have a certain propensity, a worldview to classify things. So we group things, and all the things that are within our reach, we put them in our purview. And in every lay language, we do have various kinds of distinctions that we make. The Western and non-Western, for example, the global South and the global North, the Black lives and white lives, which are very current these days. Now, one of the things, linguists being human, also love a lot of dichotomies. So I want everybody to take a minute and do a free listing. Just list all the oppositions that you know in linguistics for a moment, and we'll come back. It's a little experiment to see. So linguists love dichotomies so much, and if I've asked you to list some of them, and I'm sure some of you have listed things like functional versus formal, competence versus performance, nature versus nurture, native versus non-native, scientific versus folk, synchronic versus diachronic, innate versus learned, cognitive versus social, and it goes on. Now, even though Saussure makes this tripartite distinction in his treatise, Langage, Langue, and Parole, linguists, because we love dichotomies, we have only stuck to the langue versus parole distinction. And today I want to talk about another dichotomy that linguists live by, and that relates to things that we say belong to the core of linguistics and things that belong to the periphery of linguistics. The main sound or language system versus the peripheral aspects of language, the center of language, or the margins of language. And so this is where the idea of marginalia comes from, that the things that are left on the margins. And I invite you all to reflect a moment on a paper by Brian Joseph on the linguistics of marginality, and with the further title, The Centrality of the Periphery. And in that paper, he begins by being a little bit apologetic that if he had been daring enough, and if the editors had allowed him, he would have written this paper, writing the paper on the margins, as it were, and leaving the center blank. He wants to make the point that actually the important stuff that we are concerned with, we have put on the margins. And actually the core that we deal with is a bit empty. So he talks about the fact that the core has always attracted people's attention. However, there's much of value in considering the margins and the peripheral aspects of language. And today what I want to do is to invite you to reflect on one of my favorite questions, which is, what if linguists concentrated on the peripheries, on the margins of, or the things that they have put on the margins of language? How would the theory of linguistics look like? How would the practice of linguistics look like? I'm going to take you on a journey through some of these marginal phenomena, but I invite you to keep at the back of your mind the question, what if what if we had studied this more? How would our view of language look like? And there are a number of things that linguists have put on the margins. And in this paper that I was talking about, Brian Joseph sort of lists a number of them. And as he says, they are not exhaustive, but there is quite a number of them. So one of them he puts there is the sound symbolism. Another is language games and loan words. These, in a way, as he talks about them, because they are our exceptions to the main thing that we do. So sound symbolism, for example, because they are non-arbitrary. Then when we are talking about the arbitrariness of signs, then we are sort of pushing sound symbolic elements to the side. Loan words, the same kind of thing. Oh, they don't fit well into the main sound system. So we put them to the side. So these are the kind of linguistic marginalia that I'm talking about. These are some of the things I talk about as linguistic marginalia. But there is something else that Brian Joseph points out, which is that some of the things that we've put on the margins are on the margins because of their social marginality. They are socially marginalized, so to say. So one of them is endangered languages. And of course, one could argue that, of course, they are moving from the periphery to the center, like many other things. Or languages of marginalized social groups, like gays, LGBTQ, and so on. Or registers that we keep on the margins. And talk about emergent languages, youth languages, for example. So he talks about these two kinds of marginalia. And I'm not going to talk about the socially marginalized marginalia. That is a different line of my work, so to say. There is the other side, which is more about the linguistic marginalia. So the left-hand side of this. As Joseph points out, by ignoring such phenomena, we as linguists do our science a disservice and worse, miss out on a source of information that is highly revealing about the nature of language in general. So I've been reflecting on this, and of course, early in my development, I would say, I came across Roman Jakobson, and I hope that every linguist student will be introduced to this guy. And if you look at the kinds of things he does, it's no surprise that he talks about himself as a linguist, and nothing that pertains to language is strange to him. So let us not think that these marginalia are strange things. Let us embrace them, and we can have a better view of language. And I've been sort of thinking about one trajectory in my own research. And very early on, I studied idioms. And of course, idioms are put on the margins because they are exceptions to, if you like, compositionality. So as you know, the classic textbook example, kick the bucket, the sum of kick plus the plus bucket meanings do not equal die. So this is the problem with idioms. So we put them aside. Of course, some people have been trying to approach them. And I think even in this series, there has been a talk on touching on idioms. But the interesting thing about that is that we don't know how to handle idioms in the terms of the structural properties, the compositionality issue. So we deal with quote unquote partial idioms, so to say. Particles, yes, we say they are little words and they do not have any content, so we push them to the margins. Interjections and vocalizations, and I'll be coming back to this topic of interjections and vocalizations. So, but basically, because they are phonologically, morphologically, syntactically not your usual linguistic sign, we push them to the margins. Of course, swear words and taboo words are another. Of course, again, these things are coming in slowly. So last year, there was a handbook of Oxford Handbook of Swear Words and Taboo Language, edited by Keith Allen. Early this year, there was a volume in which I also contributed, which is about swearing and cursing from the Gruyter. So there are things happening. The question is, are we drawing on the effects? Are we drawing on the results of such research to inform our view of language? Conversational routines, which we do use every day and every time. Even at the beginning of this lecture, we had all this routine exchange and of welcome and so on. But they are so hard for us to deal with in our structural grammars. And therefore, we go on and keep them away from the center. And idiophones, and I'll be returning to idiophones also in a moment, but they belong, as it were, with the sound symbolism that we mentioned before, and so on. Then, of course, manual gestures. And in a way, I can put these gestures, if you like, on top of, say, the interjections, swear words, conversational routines, and idiophones. So there is a kind of issue there. And we push these aside, partly because actually some people would say that gestures and so on are not objective, and that when people start gesturing, then there's something subjective about it, and so on. So there are several reasons that motivate us, so to say, to put things on the margins. So what is the value of all these elements that Joseph alluded to? They are marked elements, so in terms of prosody, phonology, grammar, and so on, and semantics even. So if we are able to crack them, we would have a good grip of what it means to have a language, so to say. They are expressive, and that, of course, because we want a rational, objective thing, these expressive things we seem to think are irrational. But importantly, they are interactional tools, and we need them in the management of our interaction, in solving our coordination problems in communication. They provide clues for us to understand the nature of signs. And one of the reasons that they have those clues is because they tend to be multimodally packaged, or if you like, they tend to be composite signs. And we need to separate them somehow to get to the grip of how to do things with these signs that are multimodally packaged. And they provide a window on mechanisms of language change and language spread, so to say. I will point out some examples in due course. So Mark Dingemans, a former PhD student of mine who is now associate professor in Radboud University and who just last week got a Heineken Prize for junior research, talks about these marginalia as opportunities for innovation. That is to say that they are not obscure or exotic phenomena that can just be ignored. They represent opportunities for innovation, and they invite us to keep pushing the edge or the edges of the science of language. And this is one idea that I'm going to try to also push, that if we can study some of these marginalia, we are going to be edging towards understanding language. So my roadmap is basically the following. I have a number of goals I want to achieve, but to achieve those goals, I want to sort of use it as an opportunity to provoke and provide a means of thinking about these things that we have put on the margins of language. So the first thing is that generalizations about language and language structure, if we ignore some of these things that we have put on the margins of language, cannot be adequate, cannot be complete. And I'm going to demonstrate that with respect to idiophones and the nature of adjective classes in West African languages. The second thing I want to do is to argue that we cannot explain aspects of language structure without bringing in some of the marginalia that we are talking about, like interactional routines. And I'm going to be illustrating that from the point of view, again, of West African languages, this time in terms of matching a structural feature in those languages, logophoric phenomena, logophoric constructions, and linking that to interactional routines, the triadic communication that is so pervasive in the cultures there that you see. And thirdly, I want to present a kind of framework of analysis that could be cross-modal, cross-linguistic, and that could help us account for this phenomena so that we don't push them aside anymore as exceptions, that we can have an integrated way of looking at these phenomena. And the framework draws on the Boasian Trilogy of grammar, dictionary, and text, but expanded with what my friend and colleague and collaborator, David P. Wilkins, calls the Communicative Practices Pentagon, and superimposed with semantic clouds that I suggest. And I will apply this to the analyses of interactional devices in West Africa, especially clicks as interjections. And hopefully I'll be able to say something about one emblematic gesture at the end. So how do idiophones influence analysis? The basic idea is that idiophones are marked words which iconically depict sensory experience. They are marked in all the ways that we can think of, prosodically, where even in tone variation, so that you have a variation on a structure depending on the meaning you want to express. So if I want to talk about the sound of a big drum, I'll say poto, 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 poto. And of a small sound, then I'll say poto, 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 poto. And that gives you, so the tone variation is linked a bit to this semantics of size, so to say. So here's an example of an idiophone taken from Siwu, a Kwa language of West Africa, of Ghana. And here, this is the basic point. You see this basket and you see its weave, and you get this sensory perception of it. And you want to represent that in sound and language. And then you say it is holding itself together, sini, 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 sini. And that sini, 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 sini represents for us the fact that it is closely woven, so to say. That is an idiophone. So some further characteristics of idiophones, I mean, the phonological anomaly is already there. They do not follow phonotactic constraints. That's another thing you see. And one of the interesting things they do in Ewe, for example, is that you can reverse the syllable structure of some of these words. So you get chakli and you get klita. So it's a rough surface thing, and you see the different examples, pojo and jopo for thick and round. Idiophones are also associated with and are accompanied by gestures. And here are two researchers who have talked about these features of idiophones. And Kunene, who works in Southern Africa, talks about the fact that the idiophone is the closest linguistic substitute for a non-verbal physical act. So that's the closest substitute for a non-verbal physical act. That means the closest substitute, if you like, for gesture. And then Janice Knuckles, who works in South America, talks about these words belonging not only to language, but to an expanded conception of gesture. So you can see how she's trying to look at it. She's trying to say there is this gesture field, and we have to put language in it, as it were, and idiophones are the root to that. So, of course, there's a lot of statement in the literature about idiophones are associated with gestures and so on. And McDigamance studied several corpora of idiophones and gestures, and he tried to show that actually there is a particular type of gestures that they are associated with. They are mostly associated with iconic gestures. And as we know, there are different types of gestures. You are not going to get idiophones with beats, for example. The implications of this, of the relation between gesture and idiophones, from my point of view, is that, and this is a point that Kita made long ago, the fact that idiophones have inherent imagistic meaning. That is to say, there is a composite thing. You've got the sound part of it, but there is also this gestural aspect of it, this aspect which is of an imagery, so to say. And the question is, how can we represent this imagistic meaning? So the compositeness of the utterance means that they are multimodally packaged. So if they are associated with iconic gestures, and then they have this inherent semantics. So Kita proposed at the time that there should be a two-level semantics for idiophones and mimetics, as they are called in the Japanese tradition. So the question is, how should their meaning be represented? And this is something that we still have to work on to get to a representation of the meanings of, if you like, multimodally packaged utterances, such that we can say, okay, we have got something to say about how meaning works in language. Idiophones are not really marginal. Why? Because if you do not take them into account, your account or your analysis of languages can be defective. So about 2 decades ago, I pointed out that contrary to these elements being peripheral, idiophones form an integral part of the languages in which they occur, and they should therefore not be ignored, but should be considered in their typological characterizations. And the point here was about the adjective classes. So let's take Igbo, which is a Nigerian language. It's a Benue Congo language, and it is one which has been described in the literature as having a closed class of adjectives, which comprise 4 antonymic pairs. So you've got large and small, new and old, good, bad, light-colored, dark-colored. So these are 8. And in fact, Igbo was very instrumental in the early studies of Dixon of where have all the adjectives gone, because Igbo is one of the languages, in a sense, if you look at this list, where the adjectives have gone somewhere. But actually, this list ignores the rich quality property words that are idiophonic in the language Igbo. The interesting thing is that actually, even this 8 is not sufficient for some people. So one native speaker, Maduka Durunze, comes up and says, actually, there are only 5 basic adjectives in Igbo. So his list overlaps with the 8, but the interesting thing is, if you look at the forms that he doesn't consider to be basic, they have properties that you would make you suspect that he is taking them out because they are idiophonic. It is not clear from his description why he takes them out, but there is something about the forms as they are that could suggest that maybe he's taking them out because of their idiophonic nature, or anyway, some exceptionality about them. Now, I just talked about Dixon. And the reason I bring up Dixon is that we have this, he talks about the semantic types, and at least in the early Dixon, say the 1982 and the 1994 kinds of studies of adjective classes. The 1994 is a paper, it's an overview paper in the Encyclopedia of Language and Linguistics, where the 4 classes that we saw in Igbo were the critical things that his generalization at the time was, if you're going to have a language that has adjectives, then they would have these expressions that belong to at least these 4, the dimension, the color, the age, and the value. In fact, for the 1982 study, the 7 types, the first 7 semantic types were what were used, and there were very rich and interesting generalizations coming out, where he was making a distinction between deep adjectives and surface adjectives and so on. Anyway, if you were to look at these, you would find in many languages that these semantic types are expressed with idiophonic words. So just to give an example from Ewe, I have argued myself that there are only 5 basic adjectives, non-idiophonic basic adjectives in a language. And if you stick to this, then you will have to say that it's got a small closed class. Now, but what is also interesting about this is that there are certain holes in this pattern. So a clear hole is the fact that for value, you do not have a positive value side, a good word belonging to this class. And then if you look at color, it's very strange. Of course, you have the co-hyponyms of white and red, but you don't have the opposition with dark or black. Lo and behold, such words are idiophonic in the language. So as you see there, the dark colored word is yibo. And in fact, we do have a green, which is also idiophonic, mumu. And then you have a grayish word, which is also idiophonic, which is like P. There is all sorts of things that one can say about the color kind of domain in these languages with respect to idiophones and non-idiophonic words. But the main point for me is that, remember, age was one of the 4 semantic types. And in the 5 set of adjectives that we have here, there is no age word. However, if you look in the idiophones, you will find a number of age words. So you will find fe, which is young, ye, which is new, or even kanya, which is early. So, and we do get another value word, bada, which is also an idiophone. The point being that idiophonic words are needed to complement the non-idiophonic words to make or give a good picture of this language. There is also some interaction between the idiophonic words and the non-idiophonic adjectives in the sense of the opposites. So if you see on the left-hand side, you've got a number, I mean, in the left column, you've got a number of idiophonic adjectives, and their opposites in the middle are all derived adjectives from verbs. So the first one, the feign that we saw, and then it's got titi, old. So there is something about old. And then you've got the human propensity other term on the other side, which I don't need to go into now. But you see the kind of relationship between the idiophonic adjectives and the non-idiophonic ones, which is important for us if we are going to talk about the oppositions within the adjective class. So if we leave out our idiophones, we will be losing out on generalizations. So in summary, what I'm trying to say is that the kind of data we will consider for the characterization of categories in a language would affect the decisions or the conclusions we draw. And the claim that Igbo or Ewe or many other West African languages have a small closed class of adjectives can only be maintained if we do not consider idiophonic words. So idiophones that have been put on the margin should really move into the center to help us understand the nature of adjective classes in these languages. Different picture would emerge about the nature and the internal structure of these languages. So now I want to try and introduce a framework for the analysis of, if you like, signs, including utterances, constructions, and such analysis, such a framework would probably help us not to be pushing things to the margins. But before I do that, I want to go back a decade. A decade ago, Levinson and Evans, in their commentaries on people's comments on their paper about the myth of language universals, which appeared in Brain and Behavioral Sciences Journal with lots of commentaries. The second set, this was the second set in Lingua, and the title of that paper, the first part of that title is Time for a Sea Change in Linguistics. And they were making the point that radical changes in data, methods, and theory are upon us. The future of the discipline, linguistics discipline, depends on the responses to these changes. And either the field turns in on itself and atrophies, or it modernizes and tries to capitalize on the way language lies at the intersection of the disciplines interested in human nature. And they continue, or state in another way, if the discipline of linguistics makes the right moves, it can regain its centrality as the study of what makes us human, thus linking the humanities, the social sciences, and biology in a way that will guarantee long-term disciplinary success. I want to suggest, and actually they did call for that in the book, in the paper, that we need a framework which is cross-linguistic, which is cross-modal, and which would help us come to this point. They and I would agree that we need a change, and the move towards a change I'm suggesting relates to the fact that we should obliterate the distinction between core and periphery. We should pay attention to the things that we have put on the margins and develop general cross-linguistic methods for the analysis of all linguistic phenomena. And in the rest of this lecture, I'm going to try to present such a possible framework and apply it to show that it could work. And it draws heavily on a distinction between the grammar of language structure, which would then be integrated with the language, the grammar of language use in a particular language. So, going to the beginning again. It seems that if we are going to be transforming the language sciences, we need to start not from form, but from meaning. And again, one of the people who inspire me talks about the very essence of linguistics is the quest for meaning. And as the science refines its procedure, it inevitably becomes, as a matter of this quest, more psychological and cultural. And that is happening. So if we are going to be refining our methods of semantic studies, we will be getting to put, I would argue, linguistics at the center of the social sciences, the humanities, and the biological sciences, as Levinson and Evans talk about. But what is meaning? And again, one of the people who I feel very inspired by is Dwight Bollinger, one of the people who really persisted in the study of meaning at a time when people did not think meaning was useful. But he says something about what meaning is. And unfortunately, many people who study meaning these days have not paid heed to his sort of characterization of what meaning is. As he talks about it, he says, meaning is an extremely ill-assorted fellow. You can hardly invite him or her to your home without inviting one or more of his drunken friends. And I'm afraid a lot of semantic analysis today is full of the drunken friends of meaning. So we need to separate the meaning from the drunken friends, so to say. And here's my friend and colleague and collaborator, David Wilkins, who has what he calls a manifesto of transforming the science of language and semantics as the basis of transforming the science of language. And how do we do that? How do we do our semantics? And this is where, as it were, I'm going to be developing basically. So if you know about the Boasian Trilogy, it is a grammar, dictionary, and texts. But at the basis of that is that you start working with texts, and a text can minimally be a single utterance. So an interjection is a good example of a text, so to say. And an utterance need not be composed of linguistic signs in the narrow sense of the term. What David wants to say here is that an utterance is also something like those things that we have put on the margins, which we call sometimes non-words or noise-like elements, sound objects, not taking them as linguistic things. And texts emerge out of language use and with a community, and language use arises in relation to the enactment of social practice. So one basic basis of doing this is to start by thinking about meaning construction. How do we interpret utterances? And basically, we would have to work with 3 levels of meaning. One, which is the kind of stored, shared, structured idea about signs, whatever they are, plus their combinatorial properties. And these generate, if you like, default interpretations that get processed in what you might call a fill-in, which is the middle box, which is where the generalized conversational implicatures work, where cultural scripts work, where frames work, and these help us to get an interpretation online. And critically, when we get interpretations online, these are not necessarily senses. However, today's interpretation online can be tomorrow's meaning one, meaning sense, and it becomes a stored interpretation for that sign. And of course, so that's one set of biases that I share and work with. But a full semantic account must also be attentive to social variation at semantic level. So this is where we need a dynamic view. And that's what I meant by today's online interpretation can be tomorrow's sense, so to say. And then we have meanings of signs in the semiotic sense. And that is to say that the information conveyed by conventional signs can be described and represented. Then, in order to compare meanings, we need a meta-language. It doesn't have to be one language, but we need a form of meta-language that we can use to represent these meanings. And this is where the challenge is. How are we going to have a meta-language for representing, if you like, imagistic meanings, for example? We have enough meta-languages for talking about the verbal propositional meanings, so to say. And of course, we presume monosemy only forced to produce, to say polysemy, if we cannot strip away all the contextual things, all the frame knowledge that we need, then we go on and propose a polysemy. So these are some of the assumptions we have about communicative signs. They have a form, they have a meaningful content which can be described, they have rules governing how they combine, so this is the compositionality issue. They also have a pragmatic aspect which relates to the context that they are associated with. They have a social dimension in the sense that they are used and they often carry with them socially valenced knowledge like politeness, formality, gender, etc., etc. And all this needs to be accounted for. And they have a general function. Are they just attention getters, or are they for reference, or are they for locating things? And it's important to point out that, as Igor Marchuk said of a lexeme, in fact, what we should say is that a sign it's not just languages that are entire worlds in themselves. Signs in languages, a sign in a language is an entire world in itself. And one has to account for all this, the whole world of a sign in a language. In terms of representing meanings, as I said, we need a meta language, and I use minimal English, which is based on Anna Wisbicka and Cliff Goddard's work on the natural semantic meta language. And they talk, this has sort of 3 layers of vocabulary. You've got the semantic primes, you've got the semantic molecules, and you've got words that are sort of not universal, but useful for representing meanings in particular areas. That makes that up. So now I'm going to introduce this framework. And as I say, it's based on the Boasian Trilogy, and it's got its Communicative Practices Pentagon. So the biases, and this is an important distinction that I'll be coming back to, is that there is this, the biases we have outlined so far relate to language structure and language use. They lead us to make a distinction between those 2 things. And the trilogy and the pentagon are both necessary. That's the communicative part. And each point, and that's the semantic clouds, relates to aspects of semantics and semantic typology. So here is how the picture unfolds. Remember, I said we work with texts and everything starts from texts. So these are the communicative events that, or if you like, the cultural activities in a particular domain. So you collect these texts, and like language documenters know, you need to transcribe them, you organize them, and you code them for all sorts of things, type relations, and so on. And then from the text, you can derive things about your grammar of structure, the structure of the grammar of the language structure, and you can derive a dictionary or a thesaurus, that is to say, the lexicon, so to say. This is what is new, the Communicative Practices Pentagon. And we have, of course, it also is dependent on the texts that we have. And if you go on to the left, that's where we have the grammar of language use. And to the right, it's the ethnothesaurus. And I'll tell you in a moment what these things, what semantic points anchor onto them. Then we've got the paralinguistic repertoires, and we've got ethnography of communication. So if you look on the thing with respect to grammar of language structure, you've got semantics of logical relations and quantification and things that formal semanticists are so happy and interested in. Then if you come to the dictionary, this is also, again, the kind of structural thing. We are interested in all these taxonomies and meronymies, polysemy, synonymy, the fields and how they relate and so on. Then if you come to the grammar of language use, there we are more interested in utterance types. Utterance types being things that are derived from the cultural activities, and they form a set of things that in use, you get the utterance tokens coming out. Remember when I talked about the 3 levels of meaning, I said at the second level there, that's where utterance types work. That's where you get your default interpretations being processed, as it were, in different ways. And here we also get the routines and the prefabricated kind of utterances and the discourse pragmatics. So use entails that these things also have a grammar, they have a certain pattern, and they need to be described. The main thing I would be pointing out again is there will be languages, any 2 languages could have different structural grammars, but those 2 languages, depending on their cultural milieu, could have similar or even same grammars of use. And I'm going to illustrate that in a moment. Then we have ethnography of communication, which actually feeds into your grammar of language use, because that's where you've got the overview of communicative practices. And then what it adds is the various social roles that need to feed onto the utterance types and to the kinds of prefabricated routine things. And if you go to the other side, to the paralinguistics kind of repertoire, which interfaces with other semiotic systems. So this is where you talk about the semantics of pointing, for example, and the kinds of things that people tend to put on the margins, like the embellishments that we have, the interpreting, and so on. Then we have also the ethnothesaurus, and this is where frames come in. It's a kind of organized lexicon in terms of distinct cultural practices and cultural activities. And it's not governed by the form of the words or something of that nature. Okay, so this is the kind of architecture, which is a wrong word, I should say, of how this framework works. So let me just illustrate a difference between, or a relationship, not a difference, between grammar of language structure and grammar of language use. So I've already said this, that 2 or more languages can have different grammars of language structure, but they could have the same kind of grammar of language use. So here I want to illustrate it from West Africa again. So many West African languages have in their grammatical structure logophoric marking. And the prime example, of course, is my own native language, Ewe. And I found this as a kind of the speculative grammarian trying to explain what logophoricity is. And he says, he saw that he had all the money. Any pronoun, he and he. So these are 2 different he's. And this is the trouble we have with English. If you get to Ewe, this is very simple. So you see in the next one, if it's he saw that he had all the money, they are the same, you have a different pronoun that represents the second he. And here is just a simple example from Ewe with all the subscripts. So the first one, you see the logophoric there. So if it's Kofi wants to do something, to leave. Kofi wants to leave. So if you say Kofi wants to leave and you use the logophoric pronoun on the verb leave, then it's Kofi that is going to leave. But if Kofi wants that someone else leaves, then you use a different personal pronoun to represent that other person. This is the basic way to do it. Now, this is misleading in as far as it is as if this is clause bound. This is not clause bound. This is a phenomenon that occurs long distance, and there are lots of questions that have been raised in the literature about it. Some of them, how should logophoricity be represented and how is it expressed? How can it be accounted for, formal syntactic terms, and also in semantic discourse representation? So Leslie Sterling, for example, in her book on switch reference, devotes quite some time to trying to account for logophoricity in discourse representation. And what is the origin of logophoric marking? And what is the status of logophorically marked reported discourse? There are lots of studies about this. The point about logophoricity for me here is basically that it is, or maybe the question that I want to use it to explain is, how do we explain logophoricity in the grammars of some West African languages? And here I have a book, Speaking for the Chief. And in that book, Kwesi Yankah makes the point that you cannot but notice the use of triadic communication, the art of communicating with another through a third party, as a remarkable phenomenon in discourse. And I have argued that actually the effects of triadic communication, one of the effects of triadic communication is the grammaticalization of logophoric pronouns in some of these languages. And beyond that, there is a lexicalization of sort of the intermediary, for example, in this third-party communication. And I give you the Ochiami, which is in the subtitle of that book that I just showed you. And in Ewe it is Chami, and in Ga it's Chami. Now, the critical thing, and this is where, so in terms of use, these languages have the same kind of grammar of use. However, in structure, they are different, because among the three languages, the Akan, Ewe, and Ga, it is only Ewe that has logophoric pronouns. So how do you explain that? And this is where one would have to say that in terms of the structure, these languages are different, but in terms of grammar of language use, they are very similar or same. And one of the ways of showing you that they are similar or same is in the routinization of triadic communication practices. So one of the things that you get is basically in Ghanaian English also, for example, there is something about, and I think linguists are going to love this, about the intermediary. The intermediary is sort of called a linguist in Ghanaian English. And you can, because actually the intermediary is somebody who has a lot of oratorical prowess and who can communicate very well. Notice he will have to embellish the speech of the principal. So he is a linguist. And maybe that's what we linguists should be, embellishing the speech of language. And in addition to having this lexicalization of the intermediary, there is also the routinization of a kind of, if you like, a transmission of information routine. So it goes like this. So if I'm going to ask you to pass on the information, I will call your name, or I'll say, you hear it so that it reaches the target of my communication. And in English, Ghanaian English, we have this. So this is just an example taken from one fiction where it's a, and this is really the pattern that goes on. You ask, is the intermediary there? So is Katoko there? And then it's like calling his attention, and then you say, hear it and let it reach them that. So and so. And you see in Ewe, you get the same kind of pattern of these routines. So you have hear it so that it will reach X is the first line there. Now I do Y, so it goes into Y. Now Z channel sadeleme, so that Z will also hear part of it. And these are the account routines that Yankah gives of the Ochiami should hear or listen to it, and that it may reach the chief, or you will listen so that Nana, which is the title of the chief again, will hear, etc. I want to just illustrate with one example of vocalizations of utterances. And here I'm treating these as interjections. And I just want to sort of refresh your mind about how interjections have been put on the margins from long ago by various philosophers till today. They continue to be put on the margins. So for example, here is Max Muller, who talks about interjections are only the outskirts of real language. Language begins where interjections end. So you see, Max Muller says it's really just on the outskirts of language. It doesn't belong to language, so to say. And he goes on and talks about the difference, if you like, between real language, like I suffer, and an interjection like oh, and so on, or the sneeze, or the sneezing, as he talks about it. So this is why he thinks these things are not part of language. Nevertheless, he makes a very important point, and that is what I love, which was one of the things I used as an epigraph for my 1992 paper on interjections, which is that one short interjection may be more powerful, more to the point, more eloquent than a long speech. So I don't understand why he thinks it's not part of language. Indeed, they are so powerful. It's a good utterance. Another philosopher talks about this as the dominion of speech is erected upon the downfall of interjections. Again, that speech and interjections are things that are different, or interjections are among the least important of speech elements. This is coming from Edward Sapir, which is very strange. And what does he call them? A decorative edging to the ample, complex fabric. But of course, and in recent times, somebody, Jeff Pullum, also talks about them as so unimportant to the fabric of the language that they are almost completely ignored in grammars. There is almost nothing to say. They have no syntactic properties at all. You pop one in when the spirit moves you, and their basic meaning is simply expressive of a transitory state. I don't know if this is just simply that. I don't know if there is nothing to say about them because we cannot say anything about their syntax. There's a lot to say about them. And I'm going to suggest that interjections, being context bound, and they conventionally constitute a non-elliptical utterance by themselves, they do not enter into construction, yes, so you cannot say anything about the syntax. They are invariable and they are monomorphic. And I'm going to illustrate from West Africa again, one example of this, of one of those things that are being put on the outskirts of language, partly because they are click sounds, and partly because the clicks are not part of the phonemic system of these languages. And here's a report of what an Englishman who was living in Ghana in the 80s talked about with respect to this click. So after a few weeks in the country, he realizes that when the answer to a question is yes, so that's the first clue, it is saying yes, and the speaker did not feel too strongly about it, that's my emphasis, he or she merely made a noise, and listen to that, somewhere in the vocal tract, which did not involve any lip movement. So this one, there's no lip movement associated with it, and which was not reflected in any movement of the facial muscles. So this is just a sound that is made in the vocal tract. So I can just say, I don't know if you can hear it, but you just have this mouth closed, facial muscles not pulled, and so we can deduce from what the Englishman says that it's not stirred with strong feeling, so it's not that emotive. It is not multimodal like many other such clicks or vocalizations. And because there is no facial movement, there is no lip movement, it's just It's just that auditory thing that you need. And it means that you have to pay attention somehow. It is communicative, but it is extra systemic, as it were. It's used as a back channel signal. It can be used as a response to propositional questions, a yes/no question, so to say. And it is pan-Ghanaian. There's something that went wrong here. Okay. It's used as a back channel signal. It's as a response to propositional questions. And it is pan-Ghanaian. That's the distribution of it. It occurs in many languages in West Africa. It has been reported for Senegal. It's reported in Mali. It's reported in Togo, etc. And basically what it says is, I'm with you, right on. It's been reported for Ethiopian languages with similar functions. And it is one of these forms that has traveled to the transatlantic Sprachbund. So you get a use of it also in say, Papiamento. And so there are these other clicks, except different from, say, the sack teeth or kiss teeth, which has been very popular. But the palatal nasal click is also something that is used there. Then just last year, Pillon and Grenoble and Ngweum did a study of what they call verbal gestures in Cameroon. And they report one of these verbal gestures, which is also a click. And as they talk about it, is the back channel gesture. It's made with a post-alveolar release in the oral cavity, and typically with a closed mouth. So it's just like the palatal nasal click that I was talking about. This back channel is articulated as a click that is repeated minimum of 2 times. So in Ghana, we don't repeat it minimally 2 times. You can just say once, and that's fine. But in Cameroon, at least 2 times. And it can be repeated for an unspecified amount of time to emphasize the speaker's point of view. Of course, the repetition of things that are expressive is just one of those things there. And if I were to try and represent part of the meaning of this palatal nasal click, I would say that I know that you are saying something to me, and I want you to know this about what you are saying to me. I'm thinking about what you are saying, and I think the same as you do about these things. And I do this to show it. And I think you want to say something more. And that last component is meant to account for the fact that actually, as a back channel, it's used very much in interaction so that it's not the end of the conversation, as it were. There is another click that I can talk about briefly, which is a negation click. And this one, it's an alveolar lateral click. And here, and this is the point I was trying to make, that actually the palatal nasal click was not a multimodally packaged thing, whereas this one is multimodally packaged. In what sense? In the sense that when you make the click, you also shake your head with it. So, and 2 or 3 in succession means no, 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 so to say, with a gentle shake of the head from one side to the other. So it's used to disagree with a proposition, and it is used to reject a proposal or an offer. And here again, I just make a rough explication to capture what partially, at least, the meaning of this form. I want you to know I have heard what you said. I think you want me to say what I think about it. It's because it's about a proposition or something of the sort. I want you to know I have thought about it, and I don't think the same as you. So this is the negation part of it. I want to show what I think, and what you think is that you don't agree with it, so, and you shake your head with it. At the same time, I move my head when I say from one side to the other because of how I feel about it. In closing, I want to talk about, of course, a gesture, an aerial emblem for not to want, something to reject something. Basically, it is also a multimodal composite sign, and it's widespread in West Africa. It expresses the meaning of I don't want this, where whatever is rejected is contextually available. And it is made up of a manual gesture. And I'm going to get up so that you see what happens. So basically, if you're going to make this gesture, you bring your hand like that, and you've made your fist. And the next thing is the movement of the hands, bending them at the elbow joint, you see, and you make a fist and with your hands. And then what happens next? You move what you've done to hit the side of your body, to hit the two sides. And that means I don't want. So maybe Alex is going to try to tell me I should stop, and then I can do that gesture to him and say I don't want. But I'm going to stop. At the same time, one can say something to associate with it. So you can also say to make the point that you don't want it. So Victorianist reports this gesture for Adamobe Sign Language, which is a village sign language in Eastern Ghana. And as you see, the representation of it there, you've got the movement coming together and then doing the thing. So the point that Victorianist makes is, yes, this is a particular sign in Adamobe Sign Language for refuse, but it has a little bit more of other meanings. It's also a move gesture, so to say, a move sign, not gesture. But the point she makes is that this sign seems to be based on the gesture in the speaking community, and which is the one I've demonstrated to you, but which is very widespread beyond the village where Adamobe Sign Language is used. So to conclude, the phenomena that linguists have pushed to the margins of languages are fascinating and hold the key to our understanding of the unique thing that makes us humans. We need to investigate these and push them back to the center. In this way, linguistics can be positioning itself, indeed, at the crossroads of the humanities, social sciences, and biological sciences, as Levinson and Evans have advocated. Akpenami, thank you, obrigado.
Well, I thank you, Felix, for this wonderful talk. And well, as a researcher myself in African linguistics, I very much share your feelings that that the African languages have been relegated to the margins of mainstream linguistics. Is my screen actually showing? Excuse me. Yes. Can you hear me, Felix?
Yes, I can hear you.
Ah, okay. So yes, so the African languages as a whole are kind of considered as marginal for mainstream linguistics, along with the phenomena that characterize them. And well, you've made it abundantly clear in your talk, but I think throughout your career and your academic production and your activities, that these languages do deserve a spotlight, and that linguistics can learn, can develop a lot further when we consider these languages as essential for linguistic description. We have some questions. You had a very active audience thanking you and greeting you. So I would like to ask you something myself. Africa, I think, is a very social continent where social relations are extremely important. So what do you think is most characteristic for West African societies, and how is this? What are the mechanisms that allow culture to enter language structure down to syntax and morphology? You know, in terms of linguistic theory, I would really very much like to know what you think about this. And then I'll proceed with some more questions from the audience.
Thank you, Alex. Well, so the basis of it is for anything to come from the culture into, say, the structure of the language, it necessarily depends on the meaning of that thing. So there is a lot of studies these days about various forms of, if you like, ethnosyntactic things. So one of the things I've talked about is this logophoricity. In fact, what I sort of sketched the basis of the argument. Basically, you've got a cultural practice and you've got a language structure. It's the effect of usage on structure, because you have to communicate. And in fact, the triadic communication one is very interesting because it permeates different levels of language structure. It's in the lexicon, it's a bit in the area that I'm talking about as a grammar of language use, where you get these routines, and then it's in the structure. Actually, I've only focused on logophoricity here today, but in my earlier paper in 2004, I pointed out that actually there are various indicators in other languages which do not have, say, logophoric marking, but they have things like what in the sort of relevance literature is called interpretive particles. So actually, akan doesn't have logophoric pronouns, but it has this interpretive particle, se, that it uses even sometimes at the end of utterances to give this idea that there is a kind of representation and evidential, it's a kind of evidential strategy also to say, I am, well, it doesn't say I am reporting, but it says I am interpreting what someone has said, basically. And then if you go into Wolof, for example, there is the use of a kind of what one might call a complementizer, which actually Judith Ivan describes extensively. Judith Ivan shows actually how the impact of being an intermediary in the Wolof society and in the Sahel. Basically, you've got a kind of caste system, and there is the griots, who are the intermediaries. And the language of the griots versus the language of the nobles are different. So you get more hesitations in the nobles, but the griots are more competent. They make no mistakes about noun-class agreement, whereas the nobles do make those mistakes, etc., etc. So it's in the meaning and the interaction. At the basis of it, it's really the interaction that generates things into the structure. Without the interaction, we won't have structure. I hope that satisfies you.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Felix. We've had questions from the audience. Let me present some of them to you. We had Ana Cristina Balestro, who's asking, are idiophones present in formal written vehicles such as legal documents?
Oh, yes. So one of the sad things about idiophones is that people have earlier on said that they only occur in narratives or folk tales or something where people are performing. But in fact, and the best evidence for it is that you see that they have been adopted into English. Now, whether in legal documents, I'm not sure. However, in parliamentary kind of records, you are getting idiophones. So people can say that there are all these nyama-nyama people. And nyama-nyama people is sort of, nyama nyama is an idiophone which talks about people who are not really there. And in that kind of political discourse, which is usually heated and it's always a kind of opposition kind of discourse, there is a number of idiophones that come up. So idiophones are not restricted to genre. It's true that a performer, a narrator would make good use of idiophones to create, partly because of this sensory imaging that they have, to create that image for people to be able to apprehend and perceive. So somehow when you get these idiophones used, it's not for nothing that the earlier researchers like Westermann called them picture words. It sort of generates a picture in your mind. And so a narrator, someone who is telling a story, would use these words to create these pictures in your mind. It's true then that they will be more common in those contexts, but even in greetings, you get idiophones used in various places. So they are everywhere.
Yes, I can see how the juiciest details of the court proceedings might be actually in the idiophones when people really express, right, like what is the essence of the problem, and they get agitated. It's, yeah. We have a question by Wellington Santos from University of São Paulo. What would lead approaches to obliterate marginalia? Would this be due to theoretical reasons or exceptionalist accounts in the meaning of the graph?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is a theoretical orientation which doesn't privilege aspects of language. Of course, there is always the problem that, yeah, you cannot account for everything at the same time. However, you need to be an encompassing theoretician. Your theory should be able to make predictions that would include all the things that people have put on the margins of the language. So it's no use for us to be saying that clicks, because they fall out of the sound system of the language, they are not words. They are noise-like words. That doesn't help, because in some other language, they are not noise-like, they are really systematically contrastive. So we need to have a framework that would help us to say, in a language X, even though this thing does not belong to, if you like, the contrasting sets of sounds, in another level, it is contrasting, as I've tried to show. So you've got a palatal nasal click, and then you've got an alveolar lateral click, and the two of them, as it were, give you different kinds of meanings, one which is positive and the other which is negative. I'm getting a problem here, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, then that's fine. Good.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer. I mean, also African languages, right, in terms of number, are not marginal. They make up of 1/3 of the world's languages. So
Exactly.
there's an obligation to consider what is happening in these languages, right? If we want to understand what human language is like. So if these languages are more pragmatically and discourse oriented, then maybe we have to look there to actually find what language can do, isn't it? We've got another question by Christine Severo. What should a language policy look like if we consider the linguistic marginalia as a starting point to define what counts as language?
Okay, so here is the challenge for us. So there is a lot of discussion about whether languages or language as such is identifiable. And my take on it is basically that speakers of various languages draw boundaries of those languages. There are lots of things that are in language use that would show. So for example, in Wolof, you make a distinction between someone who is Wolof and someone who speaks another language, but also knows Wolof, a Lakat. In Ewe, you make a distinction between someone who speaks Ewe and someone who speaks some other language, which sounds as if it is unintelligible language. So you've got a verb to describe those things. So those boundaries are there. So for me, there is the first thing that languages exist, and languages are used by people to solve their coordination problems. What should a language policy look like? Actually, language policies are defective in as far as they do not pay attention to language use. What they do is they prescribe and proscribe language in various domains. So the things, for example, they will prescribe that you shouldn't use in standard language kind of things. You shouldn't use idiophones. You shouldn't write idiophones. You shouldn't write onomatopoeia. That is a thing from the kind of, unfortunately, the Western bias in our writing systems, such that in our language policies, in education especially, we focus on that which can be written. And what I try to say is that today, technology has helped us. Writing, we should never forget that writing at the time it came was a new technology. Now we have another technology. So at the time writing came, then you say, speech is ephemeral. Writing makes it permanent. Now, today, we can make language permanent in other ways than writing, by audiovisual recording. So there is a change. The technology is on us. And that means that we should change our attitude. Since I can record idiophones and interjections, if I just record what people say, then these things should inform my policy about language use. That is probably the way to go. So I think we should take advantage of the technology, and we should not exclude anything from being language.
Yes, thank you very much. We've got more questions indeed. Are you happy to take on some more?
I can take more questions.
Yes,
I'm curious what the questions are.
We have Rodrigo Madrid from University of São Paulo, who's asking, would you attribute the distinction between adjectives and idiophones in African languages to morphosyntax-focused descriptions? Would that also be an exceptionalist approach?
Yes, that's very true. I mean, the point is that the idiophonic adjectives would not carry all the properties of the non-idiophonic adjectives. So for example, the idiophonic, I can just give you an example from the talk that I gave. So we have an idiophone there in Ewe, which is for big and large, which is ga. And that non-idiophonic adjective, you can nominalize it by adding a low tone, and it becomes ga. Now, you think about the other idiophonic adjective that I talked about, the fin, which is young. You cannot add a low tone to that one to make it youth, for example. So this is why people would then say, it doesn't fit the system. So we don't include it, but it helps us to fit another system, to create a more holistic view of what we would call property concepts in the language. So indeed, it is about those morphosyntactic properties, and it is about the fact that idiophones tend to be these marked words, and by being marked, they do not share all the properties that are there for people.
So we've got one from Janneke van der Waal. She's asking, continuing on the idea that interaction is what gets into the grammar, What does the existence of mirative markers in some but not other languages tell us about those languages and their speakers?
Well, so this is one of the big challenges of talking about the, if you like, the culture and grammar kind of idea. Because what you see is two languages in the same area, which may have a similar culture, yet they make a difference in culture. And this is one of the reasons why people say, no, culture has nothing to do with syntax, but it has all to do with syntax. What we need is to study more what are the possibilities for making, for saying things about the mirativity kind of thing. It's part of our problem is we come up with these categories without articulating what they involve. What does it mean to say that there is a mirative in language X? And we know, and this is the challenge of typology, we know that the only way we can approach typology is from semantics. Yet, we want to have a certain level of abstraction to compare languages. And it's that abstraction which is the problem. We have to come down one step because meanings are expressed in different ways. It doesn't mean that you cannot express the same kind of thing in another language. However, it is those distinctions that are important for the language that you gets expressed. And that is what it is that in interaction, the things that are important in interaction get entrenched in language, in grammar. So the short or the long answer, I mean, which is the same question people put when I talk about logophoricity and triadic communication in West Africa, is basically that, yes, there are other reasons. One of the things we know, say, of logophoric marking is that it is also spread. It is borrowed. It interacts. However, and that's what is very interesting, you know that unless that language culture group shares or has a cultural practice that supports it, this form, even if it gets into that language, it's not going to be surviving. So it's the same thing about mirativity. We need to understand what it is, what cultural practice is behind mirativity. Then we can explain what the other things are.
Yes. Should we have one more?
Sure.
Okay. Felix K is asking, since social factors such as sex are agents of linguistic variation, how and at what point do such agents of variation get incorporated in your model?
Oh, they are already there. They have to be there because you have to describe. Remember what I said about a sign, that it has these social aspects. So if you are talking about a particular element, you are going to state if there is any social valency to it. Now, well, since this question comes from Felix Pogo, who I know is working on acquisition of GAN, then I think his question relates more to how is it acquired or something. At what stage would it be that there is something which is about the social valency which is acquired? But this is where, and I'm going to say something politically controversial. So the point about this is that we also need to take a good look at how we study the emergence of things in children. And it seems to me that we should take the route of language socialization. So if a sign has any social valence, it would be part of the socialization of children in that place. So depending on how the socialization works, these meaning features would accompany already many of the linguistic and non-linguistic signs that the children acquire. So there is a place for that, and that actually there are two places in the model that I talked about. Basically, in the ethnography of communication, you spell out who the participants are and what are the participant properties, if you like. And then in the grammar of language use, you will spell out their roles as participants in the interaction. I hope that clarifies it.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, let's have a very last one. Sorry, I am really straining your patience, but I'm going to keep you here as much as possible because
oh, take me to Sao Paulo. I want to be there.
Yes. Let us arrange this. You're very welcome here anytime you want to. So we have Amanda Delgado who's asking, would you consider personal words that only the particular speaker uses or creates to express a meaning X? Would you consider this as marginalia, and how would you analyze this?
Oh, well, here Amanda has caught me in the sense that when I'm talking about meaning, I am not talking about an individual's meaning, because meaning has to be shared. Meaning is intersubjective. So on that kind of score, yes, that would be a marginalia in one sense. But why is it a marginalia? And this is an important point. It is a marginalia because language is a social phenomenon. We interact with language. So as an individual, if you create just your language, you are not going to be able to use it to interact with people. Then in that respect, it doesn't have its function as a means of doing things with other people and doing things for other people. So, and yes, maybe the things that we could put on the margins are things that are so individualistic and so selfish that they are not part of the things that are shared. They are not the shared stock for a community. So that in that respect, yes, Amanda, I think this would be something that would be on the margin. It doesn't mean that it will be on the margin, but it can be connected in as far as you are not just going to be saying that to yourself. Once you start using it and other people acquire it, then it becomes part of a shared sign. So then you are also okay.
Oh my dear, I just see that James Esegbe and Michael Obiri-Yeboah are insisting that I ask you one more question. Can you refuse this?
They can ask me privately.
Yes, I think it's actually getting late, but people could feel free to keep asking questions on the chat, and the chat is going to be public on YouTube, so you can always go there and answer the questions in written form. And I definitely think that I'm seeing there's a great interest in this topic also from my Brazilian colleagues. So we definitely have to have you here and and continue these conversations live once this epidemic is over. So I thank you again for your patience with these very interesting questions, for your amazing talk, and I'll let you say some final words to your audience. Thank you very much, Felix.
Well, thank you very much all for joining in this, and I'm very grateful for the questions, and yes, keep them coming, and I will try and go and answer them on the YouTube channel. And I want to thank Abralin for the opportunity and for this great initiative. We need to think about different ways of interacting these days, and this is a beautiful and wonderful way. Interaction is what it is. Of course, this interaction has its constraints, such as that people have to write the questions and not say it themselves to me and so on, but it is mediated discourse. and it's also an important aspect of our discipline. So thank you all very much, and thank you, Alex, for moderating, and thank you, Miguel, for the invitation. That's all I have to say.